Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Public Intimacy of Kidnapping in Mexico conference. I am Dr. Zulia Orozco, full-time researcher at the Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales here at UABC, which is for its Spanish acronym. And I am delighted to have with us Dr. Conor O Reilly. That is, of course, a dear good friend of mine and colleague. I'm very happy to have him here. But before I introduce him, as well as the dynamics that it's going to develop the conference, I would like to mention that Dr. David Shirk has caught COVID, and therefore he's not available to participate in this event. So he excuses, and we hope him the very fast recovery and hopefully mild symptoms. So before I give the introduction, the dynamics, it's gonna consist on the following. We're Dr. Conor O Reilly is gonna talk and present a video and a PowerPoint for around 20 minutes or so, and then we're gonna talk on the outcomes and have some questions for him to develop and answer. Okay, so kidnapping indeed is it's a felony that we talk around lots, but there is actually few research applied in the topic, and especially here in Mexico. There has been a spiral of violence since 2008, 2010, and actually kidnapping was one of the felonies that reached its highest as currently it's happening. No, so we would like to know what's happening on kidnapping, and of course, this is a very complex term. It ranges from, for example, bridal kidnapping or parental abduction, right? A child abduction. And it goes all the way to organized crime and even terrorism organizations derived to kidnapping. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Conor O Reilly so he can talk to us about his research applied not only in Mexico City, but as well as in Juárez and in Tijuana, Baja California. So, Dr. Conor O Reilly is Pathway Director on Security, Conflict, and Justice for the White Rose Doctoral Training Partnership, Professor of Transnational Crime and Security, and Director of the Center for Criminal Justice Studies at the University of Leeds, that's in the UK. His research interests focus upon the transnational and transborder dynamics of crime, policing, and security. His recent research has focused upon kidnapping in Mexico through the Newton Fund project, Mobile Solutions to the Mexican Kidnapping Epidemic. This work continues through the ECRC Impact Acceleration Collaboration to co-produce a telenovela, a web series of kidnapping that draws upon the project findings, and that's what we're going to talk right now. So, with no further notice, now, Conor, I give you the microphone.
Fantastic. So, first of all, can you hear me clearly, Zulia? Well, first thing to say, it's fantastic to be able to deliver a presentation to a Mexican audience. I hope that my Northern Irish accent is comprehensible, and I'm told it sounds a bit like an American accent, so hopefully it's easier for that reason. But it's nice to join you at the Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales at UABC, and to talk about this project that's been ongoing for quite some years now, got interrupted by the pandemic. And we're at this stage now where we have been pre-pandemic, but we're returning to the stage now of communicating and trying to engage Mexican audiences and stakeholders with our findings. So for this reason, it's a fantastic opportunity to talk about kidnapping, an under-researched topic globally. I think Mexico is one of the places where we're starting to see that research come through, and it's fantastic to be part of that. So what I'll do is I'll say a bit about the project, and then we'll show some of the more creative outputs we've developed to engage people. And what we would really love people who are watching this recording or watching this video to do is to pick up on those and engage with them watch videos, the telenovela, watch them with your family, have an argument with your family, whatever. We want people to start talking about something that's very taboo, and often for that reason, people feel maybe on one hand they know it, they talk about it, on the other hand they feel anxiety to talk about it, and to talk about it in a way that might contribute to doing something. So having said all that, and saying how great it is to connect with Zulia for this event, it would be great if you could maybe open the slides, and then I'll start moving through them. I'll just check I can move them. Yeah, I can move them. So the public intimacy of kidnapping in Mexico. The reason that we talk about intimacy and kidnapping is this word, which conveys so many things. Like, our automatic understanding is the sort of close relations we have with people, but it expands much further to even the way that the general populace of a country responds or feels about something, and multiple other layers that I'm going to talk about within the paper is really important for kidnapping. Rolando Ochoa called kidnapping an intimate crime, and whilst he may not have talked about intimacy beyond its betrayal, what we found in our research was multiple ways in which things that are intimate, things that are public, and a complex relationship between the two was part of kidnapping. And I wanted to explain this at the outset with a couple of quotations and a couple of images. So the first quotation is what someone who was a relative of someone who was kidnapped and disappeared said to us about how it impacted them and their family, their lives. They said it destroyed our lives. It destroyed everything we made, everything. And not only my family, like it was because a lot of other families depended on my family. So I had a company with 2 partners, and we had employed, I don't know, regularly, it was like 15, 20 people, but we had to open up 100 employees when we had a lot of work. That went under. Everything was broken. Everything. I lost everything. I lost my home and a safe place to live and my family. And to continue, it started with the kidnapping of my relative. I think we all turned inward or elsewhere. When a loved one is kidnapped and suffering, it is hard to smile, talk, eat, laugh, sleep. But when the kidnapping goes on for so long, and as everyone is trying to cope with it in his or her own way, there's always disapproval, antagonism, or blame between the ones waiting. And I guess what this shows is that if we think of an intimate connection, we feel of the love that people feel for the relative that's been taken away. But we also need to think of the very intimate and closed in suffering and trauma that is developed. Once that loved one is taken away, the family that is maybe dealing with ransom negotiations won't often be talking to anyone else about what's going on. They may be talking to the authorities. They may not even trust the authorities. So they are in a very closed in, intimate way dealing with this problem. And so on the one hand, this affects, it has a ripple effect out to families, employees, wider communities. In the other sense, it closes in and it forces people to retreat into themselves. And there's 2 images here that I wanted to start off with. The first one is a painting by Antonio Castro that we came across during fieldwork in El Paso. And it was showing the emptying out, the depopulation and the desertification, people leaving Juarez during what was called L'época de Violencia by one of the people we interviewed. And we see families leaving, and there's a large exodus of people from social life. The city became empty, as happened to many border cities. With informal curfews, people retreating into their homes. And the image on the right is of a mass demonstration in response to various security issues, but specifically the key focus, the abduction, kidnapping, and murder of Fernando Marti in 2008. And his father, Alejandro Marti, as some of you may know, became a focal point for trying to push for, hopefully this is still image 1, and you can hopefully see the image on the right-hand side of the protest in the square, with the flag. And his story, when he raised the public attention towards it, showed how something that was very intimate suffering became public. And when he saw these demonstrations, he actually said that he had lost a son, but that Mexico had gained one. So these are some of the sort of background issues that I wanted to highlight. We have kidnapping having this real impact on family lives, but under wider cities, wider communities, and at key moments when certain cases receive mass public attention, the country itself. And through the presentation, I'm going to talk about kidnapping's loss, its betrayal, attempts to preserve it and restore it. So to say a bit about the project, Mobile Solutions to the Mexican Kidnapping Epidemic, beyond elite countermeasures towards citizen-led innovations, this project revolved around one key question, which is how do you counter kidnapping when you cannot access private solutions or rely on the state? And within that, we divided the project up into two work packages. One on citizen-led counter-kidnapping that was led by my colleague Ernesto Schwartz-Marin, that tried to collate all the different ways in which people had responded to kidnapping, to try and deal with it, to mitigate the risk of it happening to them, or how they would handle it if it occurred. And the second work package was transborder effects and transnational solutions, which I led on, and with a postdoc. And we worked in two transborder spaces, Juarez and El Paso, Tijuana and San Diego, doing 38 interviews, and also doing interviews in Bogota and Medellin to see how people had dealt with kidnapping and responded to it in creative ways in that setting. So as I said, kidnapping is this weird crime that is very intimate and very traumatic for those directly affected, but that can also seep out into public space. And in this way, I wanted to show that it's both intimate and taboo. And when I say taboo, I mean that people sometimes don't like to talk about it. One thing we found with some of the interviews and workshops is a reticence on the part of people to talk about it. One said, I don't want to talk about it. It's like the law of attraction. The minute I start talking about it, I'm bringing it towards me. So it's intimate and taboo, but it's also public and societally pervasive. People will be very aware of this crime in Mexico. And some of the ways that it's present in public life, I just wanted to point to some of the sort of ways that can be in public space that people might walk past every day but not recognize. So in Reforma in Mexico City, we have these plaques at the top of this grand avenue, and remembering people who've been abducted, kidnapped, and disappeared. This one says that the individual is fue secuestrado, estoy desaparecido. And behind that plaque, there's a whole story of a family suffering, an attempt to ensure that that loved one is remembered and placing it in a public space. And the photojournalist work of Ingrid Hernandez has taken images from Tijuana of safe houses from Arellano Felix cartel and posters of people looking for loved ones. And as he says, objects found in public space are connected to intimate aspects of people's lives surrounded by kidnap violence. So within these border spaces, we see a loss of intimacy, not just in the family environment, but within the cities themselves. Josh Kuhn referred to the kidnapped city. And this is the sense that people's lives became massively impacted by kidnapping. This is in Tijuana during the peak. We see autocontención, we see people retreating into their homes, retreating away from public life. We see those who can afford it going into gated communities, living within them, seceding or retreating into these safe spaces. We see the closing of social circles, not wanting to mix too far because more mixing exposes to more risk. We see the removal of visible displays of wealth, not having the expensive car, not wearing the expensive jewelry, and building a range of security protocols into everyday practice. And as one person we interviewed said, we don't go to the bank, we don't go anywhere. We go out to restaurants, go out to friends' houses, but when there is a peak, no one goes out. You get home and there's no milk, and that's too bad. And they continued, well, yes, the rich have the means to hire private security, and they can barricade their streets so no one comes in, and they can hire private guards, and they can do this and they can that. But that is creating your own prison instead of participating in order to make things better. So what happens is they create their own prison. They retreat away. And the other thing that amplified the public insecurity and the breakdown in the intimacy within communities was this notion that people could be betrayed, the betrayal of intimacy. Ochoa in his work talks about the treason phenomenon and how in elite kidnappings in Mexico City, 70% of kidnappings were instigated by someone who was close to the person who was kidnapped. But within Tijuana, also within Juarez, what we came across was a phenomenon of listas, that people who are kidnapped were asked to give the names of other potential kidnapped targets or for people who they wanted to protect as a condition of release. And what that meant was people didn't want to know anyone who had been kidnapped because that was getting close to the risk. Kidnapping is also predicated upon the shared knowledge that people have about their targets, their movements, their wealth, their vulnerabilities, their assets. And kidnap negotiations themselves are all about reminding the loved ones of the person that they've abducted is still alive, that they're suffering, they're being tortured. They're under all of these pressures to try and, manipulate that emotion to get them released. But going back to this thing of how it impacts and deteriorates public life, a doctor who we interviewed said this to us. He said, if my friend got kidnapped, my close friend, I would be very frightened and would change my car for another one. I would do things. The danger is close to me because he knows me and he's my friend and he loves me and everything, but he will talk because he will talk. I am sure I would do it if I was in the same situation. I mean, I wouldn't blame him. So you have this situation where the threat sort of seeps out and augments the feelings of insecurity within those places where kidnapping becomes endemic. And we see a sort of fatalism emerge that we also encountered. People had known people who were kidnapped that didn't return. They were disappeared, they were killed. And in one case, someone we spoke to said, I can tell you my family is one of those families that will not pay a ransom. It is a security measure for the whole family, the extended family. So they have a fatalistic approach. To preserve the family unit, they basically cut off and don't try to pay the rent, don't take the pressure not to pay the ransom for the person who was abducted. And people ask me, has this happened? And yes, we came across cases of this happening through the research. But what also happened when people felt that this was the reality they faced was that they separated the family. And this is what I call the intimacy distance paradox. So this same person said, when that decision was made, I didn't think twice of taking my kids across the border to the US. So they moved away from the threat and split the family in half. And this is why what is called a megxodus happened. Just across the border in El Paso, just across the border from Tijuana, and places like Otay Mesa, Chula Vista, we have these sort of gilded colonies of Mexicans that during peak of the violence moved across, people who could access investor visas, moving to safe residential communities across the border, and then maybe traveling back and forward for their work, managing their work remotely. What happens though is that this disrupts the family life. The wife and the kids might be in the US. The husband continues to work at risk in Mexico. And as this respondent to our fieldwork said, the distance for me is almost 8 years of living away from my husband. It really does take a toll because you grow apart, and that's the reality. So I think there's a bigger cost than one would have expected, or than what I would have expected. So, there's this loss of the family and the feeling of having the stigma of having abandoned their home city or some of their friends or family who didn't have that luxury to move across. Briefly on how intimacy is played with in the negotiation. We have the kidnappers with massive knowledge of the families and their wealth when they have done their planning for this. And just one example, one interviewee said that the kidnapper said, "Sell your antique car, go tell your sister so that she can give you the money." So they knew a lot of stuff about my family, but we never knew who was feeding them that information. So within the negotiating process, there can be shared knowledge, and an intimacy lying within shared knowledge that the kidnappers have about the family. And then the kidnappers will use silence to manipulate the feelings of the loved ones. They'll use threats and cruelty and violence. The families themselves may have to select who is the most calm, who is the coolest negotiator who'll be able to handle this, who will we hire, maybe as if they can afford to hire a negotiator, who will support them through this process. Will they hire someone locally? We met someone who hired their support from outside to avoid any risk that they could be linked to the kidnappers. And then after this happens, after the kidnapping, the problem that many families encountered is that there's a stigma attached to kidnapping. And this comes from the fact that both north of the border and south of the border, there is a law enforcement line that will often say that those who have been kidnapped are those who have been involved in something they shouldn't be involved in organized crime, something dubious. And people who you spoke to would often recount how sort of rumors and victim blaming statements come out that sort of damage the reputation of the person who's been kidnapped, often also killed and disappeared, and that then impact their family. And the issue is, how do you restore the reputation? How do you restore the intimacy? How do you confront this victim blaming? And a case that emerged in Tijuana following a kidnapping there in the first decade of the 2000s was the relative published an open letter in the local newspaper that then got picked up, that led to mass protests that got covered in international media, which actually brought more threats to the family who wrote it. They had to flee and leave. But they basically called out the state, called out the law enforcement for failing to protect them, and reasserted the integrity, the reputation, and the honor of the family through this letter. And it's a way to restore what had been lost in a very public way. We are seeing the very personal traumas, the very personal suffering of what happened being brought into the public domain, and this public intimacy around kidnapping that exposes the failings of the Mexican state. So that's a snapshot of our research. I just wanted to say a little bit about the tools that we have used and developed through the project. One of the things we did was a graphic novel, a comic, where we synthesized the various lessons in counter-kidnapping from different people who contributed to it. It's called Por eso las dunas. It's available through the Make website that is linked to the project. And things like building sort of islands of shared knowledge, strategies to deal with the negotiation became folded into a storyline within the comic. We developed an app with the panic button and other things. I must admit, the app did not turn out as we planned, and we have developed, Ernesto, my colleague, has developed a video game that really has taken place of the app. And we have a workshop on kidnapping that looked to start the process of building a global community of kidnapping scholars for this really under-researched field. And again, that's available online, and it's a great resource for anyone who wants to learn more about kidnapping. What I'm going to do in a minute is show one of the episodes of Amor Secuestrado that merged social science and soap operas to counter kidnapping in Mexico. Now, the issue about why we did a sort of telenovela about kidnapping is it's such a traumatic issue. It's so difficult to find an entry point to get people to talk about it. So we figured that a telenovela would be a good way to synthesize some of the things that we found from the research, build them into storylines, and then put them in a way that people could watch them in schools and universities, people could watch them with their families, and they could think about what they would do in these circumstances. What did the people who were in it do wrong? And maybe they can improve their peer-to-peer security planning within the family unit. And we'll show an episode of that in a minute. The other thing that Ernesto has developed linked to this project, as part of our impact acceleration work, is a video game called Código Secuestro. And the idea is people watch the telenovelas, then they do a planning of how they would insulate and manage a kidnap incident within their family through this video game. It's really a fantastic resource. So please do check it out. The web address is there, and I think you'll enjoy it. So what I'd like to do is just stop the slides now, and maybe Zulia, we could show the episode 3 of Amor Sequestrado. Fantastic.
Lo primero que tengo que contar sobre mí es que mis amigos no me dicen Jorge. Todos me conocen como Juárez, excepto mi mamá Estela, porque vengo de Ciudad Juárez. La mamá de mi hijo se llama Margarita, como la que fue esposa de Benito Juárez. Incluso unos dicen que me parezco, pero yo no creo. Margarita y yo nos dejamos porque ninguno de los dos queríamos estar en esa relación. Lo único que nos unía era Chavita. Pero él decidió quedarse con su mamá. Lo veo cada fin de semana y casi siempre me cuenta algo que ya sé porque me lo dice su mamá o lo veo en su Face.
Nos vemos en la noche. Bye.
Hoy vi a mi hijo y me di cuenta de que no tenemos tantas cosas de qué hablar. A veces siento que a mí no me pasa nada. Como que desde que vivo solo con mi mamá me la paso así, solito y sin nada interesante que contar. Pero por eso quiero cambiar y mostrar mi lado divertido. Pues no, no soy muy millonetas ni nada por el estilo, pero no estoy tan amolado como pareciera. Tengo mucho que ofrecer. Oye, yo no soy de esos que engañan a las chavitas para abusar de ellas o algo así. Después de todo este tiempo, tú ya sabes todo de mí, pero yo de ti casi nada. ¿Qué te parecería contármelo cara a cara? ¿Nos vemos?
¿Ya te vas a ver con alguien o qué?
Sí, y ya voy bien tarde.
Es con la que te mensajeas todos los días, ¿verdad?
Chance. Bye.
Cuídate, bye.
A ver, necesito que esté tranquila. Tenemos secuestrado a su hijo, pero se lo vamos a devolver en cuanto nos dé lo que pidamos. ¿Ok? Estela, si usted me cuelga esta llamada, automáticamente se despide de su hijo. No, no se lo voy a pasar, porque aquí pinches mando yo, ¿ok? Deje de llorar y dígame, ¿cuánto dinero tiene a la mano para salvar la vida de su hijo?
Deje el dinero y las tarjetas en el hotel que le acabo de decir. Señora, no le vaya a decir a nadie porque tenemos intervenido su teléfono. Estela, si comete una pendejada, se va a arrepentir. ¿Estamos? Si nos cambia la jugada, señora, hasta el pinche chava va a salir jodido. Lo estamos vigilando.
¿Dónde estabas?
¿Qué pasó? En el cine.
¿Estás bien?
Sí, mamá, ¿qué pasó?
Me llamaron que te tenían secuestrado. Les di todos mis ahorros. Ay, qué bueno que estás bien, hijo.
No, tranquila. Shh, ya. ¿Cómo que te hablaron?
Ay, mijito lindo.
No, estoy bien.
Otras noticias, autoridades locales continúan la búsqueda del periodista Rafael Medina, desaparecido desde el 19 del mes pasado.
Fantastic. Thanks for putting up the video there. I wonder if we could just open the slides again briefly, just for one slide that follows up on that. Fantastic. So, this episode, I maybe talk about it a little bit more with Zuli in a minute, but it's obviously to do with virtual kidnapping. The reason for showing it, we have 5 in total that are coming. This is 3 and 2 have yet to be released. Those should be released very soon. This is the one where we can see the intergenerational dynamics. We can see different family members on both sides, the virtual kidnappers and the victims of the virtual kidnapping, the secuestro digital. And it would be great if people watched this and did the following things. If you're watching this video, go to amorsequestrado.com and watch the 3 videos that we have, and there'll eventually be 5. Talk about them with your family, and then play the video game Código Secuestro, which is at datajustice.mx/Código Secuestro, and plan how you would set up your family to manage an incident. And the idea here is we get people to discuss this issue that can be a pervasive insecurity, but also taboo. To think about what would your family counter kidnapping plan look like. Also to think about what other stories and narratives about kidnapping need to be heard. And what other ways can we positively harness the public intimacy of kidnapping to break taboos and catalyze counter kidnapping. So we are taking the findings of the project, building them into the telenovela, the video game, and we're making public this intimate experience of a very difficult crime, and trying to find a way to get more people to engage, increase awareness, and to think about what they would do in that situation. So that's the end of the presentation. We can close off the slides, and do go to the websites, watch the telenovela, and play the video game. So we can close the slides.
Fantastic, Conor. Thank you so
Fantastic.
much for your presentation. I find particularly relevant this conference because, as you mentioned earlier, there is an understudied criminal phenomenon that it's going on in Mexico, and as well as many other parts of the world, of course. But this research is applied to the border cities as well as Mexico City. So I find this conference relevant because, considering that a few researchers have done applied research, such as Rolando Ochoa and yourself, as well David Shirk, of course. These tools can reach the community that you want that, of course, and this engages them through the video game and the videos, the telenovelas, right? So I was gonna ask you. I have a couple of questions, of course. Considering that this is, I mean, it's a personal issue. It's intimacy, right? It's a taboo problem that has a double-edged outcome. That has family outcomes, as well as the city sites, as you can see them, like the placa that you show us in the video, right? And we can see all around posters of persons that are missing or they're looking for it, no? So I was wondering, what are you else thinking of doing with the video, with the telenovelas? What are the next steps on the using these videos, of course? And the other one is, what other results, research results have you had in the outcomes that are not here?
Sorry, Zulia, I lost you for about a minute. You are. Well, the last thing I heard was about it increasing the awareness, and then I lost. Sorry.
It used to happen. Okay, so I was mentioning that there's, of course, a lack of research on kidnapping. There's an understudy. Are you there? Okay, on this issue. So this event I found particularly relevant because you're reaching out the Baja California community, right, to have the proper tools to talk about a taboo theme, a taboo problem that is going on since 2 decades, no, at least, that you have studied. So I have a couple of questions, of course. What else are you trying to do with the telenovela? What are the following steps, or what's the plan to use the telenovela that you have the outcome right now? So you'll be sharing it on the web as well. What other activities are you thinking on developing in the following months or years?
So the first thing I think I should say, that in trying to get through everything in front of us, we're very lucky. We had these amazing young filmmakers to help us with the telenovela, Verde Azul Producciones, and they made something happen that we would have struggled without their support. You know, it's been amazing. A really fantastic way to collaborate with people who genuinely care about Mexico and care about this phenomenon. So that's something to mention. They made our findings possible on these videos. As regards what we're doing with them, the objective is we're going to have an in-person launch and screening in Mexico City in the summer. We hope to do something similar up in the border area at some stage in the future as well. And the objective there will be to organize, try and create some big attention towards these resources, first of all, hopefully to get increased media attention, but also to have invited people who will come, who will watch it, then give feedback and workshops, then go watch it with their families, and then feedback afterwards on this discussion within the family unit, because it's all about the family unit. In a lot of kidnapping, not everyone, but in most of them, It'll be the families that will be contacted. It will be the families that will be worried. It will be the families that will be left to deal with it afterwards. So we really want young people to bring it into their family homes to discuss it with them. We also then will be inviting stakeholders to see if there's a way we can get these sort of resources integrated within educational programs. And that's sort of trying to sort of amplify and expand what we're doing. Because we all know that we can publish a beautiful academic paper, but how many people will read? Sometimes my wife will read it, you know, but people do read them. But I think we need to find other more accessible ways to communicate our research. And the plan for the future is also to do academic works that interact with these resources. So you'll be reading the academic work, but you'll also go then and look at the telenovela or play the video game. And we create that exchange and interchange between the two. So we have events planned for Mexico City, events planned for the border, and something on my recent time here in California and in Tijuana that we've been able to finally arrange is turning the story of someone who really overcame a lot of family suffering and massive impact of kidnapping to rebuild their lives. And we're working to turn that into a graphic novel as then another source of a creative way to engage. But again, it's maybe not the most traumatic or reliving the horrors of it. And it can again encourage people to use the resources to think about this problem and to discuss it with other people. And so that's another example of something we're doing. I think through this project, it has pushed us to be a bit more creative, you know, about mechanisms of impact. The challenge we have is reaching those audiences. That's where we need to put in the work. And things being readily accessible is key. So what I would do is I'd really encourage people who watch this, who are interested, to share it with friends and families, and then we can try and make these resources, you know, reach out and find people.
Sure, because you're raising awareness, right? I mean, this is a felony that is taking place especially in certain cities. As before engaging in the video in this conference, you were telling me that this is actually a problem more a Western problem than in other countries in the world. But
yeah,
that's the thing, that you're raising awareness and having the proper tools that maybe kids or teenage can use, and then later on reach out to their families to make a plan at least, and have a notion on how to react towards this felony. But I would like to ask you, we were talking before the conference, and you were telling me that the outcomes of kidnapping affects differently in multi-level the different groups on the society, right? The ones that have more income than the ones that don't have as much. So if it's possible, could you please develop more the idea?
Yeah, so it ties into what you're saying about the type of lens that people look at kidnapping through, right? So for a while, it's changing, but for quite a while, we thought about rich Westerners being kidnapped when they went to dangerous parts of the world, or at least in the West, right? Where I come from, that's where people do it. It totally misses the fact that most people who get kidnapped are from countries where it's a problem. You know, they're ordinary Mexicans, ordinary Nigerians, or Iraqis, wherever it happens to be that the problem is. And the patterns of kidnapping change. You know, initially the first wave is elites, whether that's local elites or transnational elites. And then what has happened, and you know, people have written about this, and a show has talked about democratization. The threat moves down. And what we saw at the border was those with money can insulate themselves in loads of layers of private security, or they can move across the border. Even we found, someone said that members of the main cartel in the area had also moved his family across the border for security. So he had moved his wife and kids and sent his kids to school across the border in the US. And so the sort of threat disseminates. So there's like the targeting of people who can't move. If you have an immobile industry, right? Your job is tied to that street corner selling tacos or picking up people in a taxi or whatever it happens to be. They're easy pickings. The virtual kidnapping in the video that we just saw, that's an easy, what someone said was, bad guys do the easiest things, right? So it's easier maybe to get the foolish tourist, to get the older person who's maybe not as streetwise, and the patterns shift and move to different groups. As I'm sure you'll also be aware, the other big area for kidnapping is the move towards kidnapping migrants passing through Mexico, because they're not going to report it to the authorities, you know, and kidnapping them is not going to cause the same backlash from the local community. So it's almost like, I think of it like moving a little bit like a virus. As defenses emerge somewhere else, that moves to the vulnerability in another place. And I guess that's why we talk about the epidemic of kidnapping, right? It sort of has that sort of connotations of moving to where there's more vulnerability.
Fantastic. I would like to remind our auditorium that this conference is taking place because this felony is common. So these tools that you provide, which are free and you can download whenever you want, or in the comfort of your house, has 5 videos, and there's going to be, of course, the it's not a comic, it's a, how do you call it?
So what we'll have that I think people will find interesting, we have from that first project, we have a comic that's like a manual, a handbook about what you might do. We have the app, we have the workshop, which shows lots of presentations.
Mm-hmm.
But then after that, we developed the telenovela and the video game. And the video game is very interactive. You could sit down with the computer or laptop in front of you and do it with your family members. You decide which family member is best to do what role, and then it role plays out an actual kidnapping incident and negotiation with different types of kidnappers, the novice, the experienced, you know, all of these things. So, and it has an element of randomness built into it. So it's a way to get people to think and interact, raise awareness, but it really takes some time to think about, well, what would we do if this happened in our household? Who would be the best person to do what? You know, these sort of questions.
Yeah, because then again, as you mentioned, this is imagining that there is no support out there for you to reach towards authority. So what can you do? What you have with your hands, what can you do to solve the problem, right?
Yeah.
So also, I was wondering if you could talk to us about, there's 5 videos, of course, the telenovelas, and if you can share with us like the main characteristics of them, so the community can reach them and see them.
Yeah, so we have 5 videos. 3 are online at the minute. The other 2 are being finalized. I have to say that the process was massively interrupted by COVID because we couldn't film anything during the pandemic. And again, that's a lucky thing that our collaborator stayed with us. But the first 2 episodes, without giving too much away, we have to keep an element of suspense. They capture the notion of betrayal within kidnapping, which is a big deal. I mentioned it in the presentation, but in a lot of cases, people feel or suspect that someone else pointed the finger, gave information about them, maybe for even to protect themselves, to get free, right? But so it's that element of the treason phenomenon. Someone shared details or put someone in the line so that they could be kidnapped. So the first 2 episodes deal with that scenario. The 3rd episode deals with secuestro digital, virtual kidnapping. And just actually within the last week, my colleague sent me a case of a virtual kidnapping in Oaxaca. And we think of these things, of course, if someone phones me up now and says, oh, I've got your wife and you can't go off the phone, I'm going to, I know what this is. But the levels of sophistication that are being built into this and learning people's travel itinerary, learning their family names, psychological manipulation and social engineering to ensure compliance are getting more and more developed. And it might be that the person who is targeted for the phone extortion will be someone who is more vulnerable to being extorted, right? So it could be someone far off in the US. It could be someone is in the beach out in the sea for a couple of hours, and someone knows that, and they harness that. So go ahead, Zulia. You said a good question.
And the last question that I would like to mention is on the global seminar that you have, the network that you organized back in 2019. I think you have over 5 years analyzing kidnappings in Mexico, and that was a fantastic outcome. That thank you. You invited me, and I participated there as well, and I learned a lot in there on the different kind of kidnappings, which is a very complex phenomenon. So I was wondering if you're thinking of continuing the global seminar, or what are you thinking on doing on that?
It's funny because with the pandemic, this was something that sort of a lot of things lost steam. I think it is something that will be returned to, because what I'm increasingly conscious of is that everywhere where kidnapping is a problem, it has specific dynamics. So the patterns of kidnapping in Mexico, even in a specific place in Mexico, may be different from the patterns in kidnapping somewhere else. So to give some examples of why I think it is important to try and build this community of kidnapping scholars.
Anti-kidnapping.
Anti-kidnapping scholars. And because, if we think of Mexico, someone said to us in the field work, kidnapping could be for 5 minutes or kidnapping could be forever, right? In another place, someone could be kidnapped for months, years. The temporal dimension of kidnapping is very different. What's also different here in Mexico is the overlaps with other crimes, the overlaps with smuggling migrants, the overlaps with homicide and disappearance. The fact that some people who might be kidnapped later actually become part of the kidnap gang. They may be forced into joining organized crime, forced into the sex industry, forced into the drug industry. And these are just some of the elements within Mexico. Or maybe it's the kidnapping by the state, right? So doing this research and having that meeting made me think so much about, we need to remove this notion that, of course, it means taking someone away, coercively keeping them separate, but understanding all of the differences in all of the different places. So another example would be, what happens when you have something like a church or a state taking children away from their parents? Do we think about that as kidnapping? In Ireland, where I grew up, single mothers would go to institutions. The children might be adopted somewhere else. And is that a kidnapping if we think a bit more broadly about it? Is it, people are writing about it in Argentina, the children of people disappeared by the dictatorship were adopted into families of dictatorship agents, another form of state kidnapping. And the more we look at other contexts, I think the more we'll see these divergences and differences, and we enhance the understanding. People have written about border control as kidnapping. When you separate kids from their parents and say, well, until you've promised to leave, you're not going to see that kid again. Yeah. Are you coercively extracting, something from them through kidnapping? So there's all these different dimensions, and I think that building a group of people are addressing it and giving them the intellectual and theoretical frameworks to do it. Like, what would the telenovela look like if it was written in Nigeria, or if it was written in the Middle East or Libya? These lots of different things can be done, or what would be the best way to raise awareness? So I think all of those things are really important.
Oh, fantastic, Conor. I have learned lots with you on this issue. As you mentioned, there's an natural overlap with other felonies, specifically disappearance here in Mexico, no? And in some cases homicides. But I would like to just mention that these tools are civilian tools, and of course there to support and make awareness in the community. So to be prepared in case of, right? But they have to reach, of course, the authority on such problem, no? Well, before we close, I don't know if you would like to make a final comment. I mean, I'm delighted, and of course, your co-researcher, Ernesto Schwartz, also specializes on kidnapping and disappearances. So this is it might sound like easily, but it's not only 5 years of research. I think you guys in common have over 10 years, right?
Yeah. Julia, I think there's a question somewhere. I
Yeah.
can't see it.
There's a question. Dr. Elsa de Jesús Hernández says, I'm going to read it in Spanish and then I'm going to translate. ¿Cuál es el alcance de las políticas de seguridad pública estadounidense para impedir la violación de la soberanía mexicana ante recientes casos de secuestros y asesinatos de ciudadanos americanos? Which mean, what is the security political reach of the U.S. regarding the U.S. citizens kidnapping in Mexico? They're very recent, like 2 weeks ago or so.
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question. It's something I didn't have time to build into what I discussed because I had a slightly different focus. We interviewed U.S. law enforcement because we interviewed people both sides of the border. And whilst I know in that recent case, people were shot and killed when they were supposedly the mistaken identities, I think it was in Matamoros. But generally, U.S. law enforcement were really confident that if a U.S. citizen was abducted and kidnapped, that they would be able to get a successful resolution because they could apply sufficient pressure on the law enforcement across the border that it would ensure it got resolved. I think it also comes back to what they've shown in the past, that how hard they will go in if something happens to U.S. citizens. And there's famous cases of how hard they've reacted when things have happened to U.S. law enforcement within Mexico. But it was something that was quite striking that I'm sure U.S. citizens, the express kidnappings happen, the sort of extended robberies where they take them on a tour of ATMs. But the finding was that for the prolonged kidnapping, that was less. The U.S. law enforcement felt seemed to express to us anyway that they were confident there would be a positive resolution because of the pressure they could exert across the border on their compatriot authorities in Mexico.
The political issues, which actually happened like in the recent scenario in Tamaulipas, right? And of course, the U.S. has lots of developments regarding prevention with the industrial sector that is in the border. They have like mechanisms operating year long, right? So, anyways, Conor, would you like to have a final comment?
No, I think the main thing is that, first of all, it's lovely to present to a Mexican audience. We have presented stuff in Mexico, but this is the sort of stage of rolling things out that have taken, because of the pandemic, basically taken many years to pull together. And it's fantastic to reach this stage. We'll have the complete set of telenovela episodes within the next month or two, well, maybe 2 months. And then we'll have the launch activities. To find, the Amor Secuestrado website is there. The website for the Código Secuestro was also on the slides. So maybe if people want to go back to those and look them up, it would be fantastic. I think the main thing is that what Mexican citizens know much better than me is that the need for this problem to be addressed is longstanding, and it's very complicated and it's not going to happen overnight. Yeah. It's the issue of thinking about what can be done in the midterm before we arrive in a situation where the agencies of criminal justice in the state are acting to protect citizens in a way where this crime will dissipate. And there's many factors linked to that. But just the small incremental things that can be done is raising awareness, talking about it, making plans for if it happened to you, and maybe also questioning things like victim blaming when we hear about something that has happened to someone. I remember the case very well of interviewing 2 different people in Tijuana, and one, the life was closed off. They were sitting, they were isolated in their community. They retreated totally into themselves. and that trauma had perpetuated. And I thought, where is the support for these people? You know, like even going outside the house or going to church was a big pressure. And then someone else who had, maybe, I don't know, personally resilience, maybe wealth, had been much better placed to overcome it. So I think hearing those different narratives, and not just those of the high profile elite, and about what we can do to support those impacted. So look at the resources, share them, and talk about the issue, and be sympathetic to the stories that you hear.
Thank you, Conor. Do you think we can share? Do you mind if we share the links here?
Yeah, they're there. They can maybe added to wherever the recording is placed. Just put in the links within the information underneath it.
Yeah, they are free to download.
Yeah.
So, and well, I want to thank you deeply for being here and learning from you. This is an understudied felony that has unfortunately lots to continue to be researched. And I think you have been doing a phenomenal work reaching out towards a global community of scholars and as well as activists and UN participants, that we learn in a very high value of knowledge. So these tools are for free, are for the Mexican community, thinking that these are preventive, skipping the taboo that naturally arises around this phenomenon. So trying to break this inertia so we can have more tools and learn from the past. So this with this, I would like to close the conference. I want to thank you, of course, Conor. I want to thank Conor and David. As I mentioned earlier, David caught COVID and he could not be with us. And I want to thank, of course, all the team that has made this possible, the conference, Monica, and all the team back that supported this and made this possible, as well as the auditorium that has watched the conference. So we'll see you then in incoming results.
Yeah, we'll see you maybe in Mexicali or on the border sometime soon. Thanks so much, Julia, and thanks everybody for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Conor. Bye.